The day the Georgia raid unfolded felt less like a routine legal operation and more like the opening chapter of a political earthquake that had been building beneath the surface for years, as quiet streets suddenly filled with law enforcement vehicles moving with calculated precision, their presence signaling that something far bigger than paperwork was about to be exposed. And inside the offices connected to election operations, tension spread rapidly as people realized investigators were no longer circling the story from a distance, but stepping directly into the heart of it, searching for evidence that many feared could reveal a hidden effort to manipulate the very machinery of American democracy ahead of the crucial midterm elections. Every step agents took echoed with consequence. Every drawer pulled open, every computer disconnected from its network carried the weight of potential revelation, as if each object might hold proof of secret meetings, coded communications, or plans carefully crafted in the shadows, while outside reporters tried to piece together what was happening, speculating whether this was simply about past actions or the first strike in uncovering a broader strategy designed to influence future elections, one that critics argued had its roots in Donald Trump's refusal to accept defeat in 2020. Georgia was not chosen by chance in this unfolding drama because it had become the battleground where Trump's post-election pressure campaign reached its most intense point. The state where officials were urged to overturn certified results, where phone calls were recorded that later shocked the nation, and where resistance from local leaders turned Georgia into both a symbol of democratic resilience and a target of political resentment, making it the perfect focal point for any deeper attempt to challenge or reshape the electoral process moving forward. What made the raid feel especially dramatic was the silence from authorities, who revealed little but moved with clear confidence, suggesting they had spent months, perhaps even years, building a case strong enough to withstand political backlash, and that whatever they were seeking was not speculation, but evidence tied to real actions, real people, and potentially real efforts to cross legal boundaries in pursuit of power. For Trump, the moment was instantly framed as persecution, another example of what he called a corrupt system trying to destroy him and his movement. But for investigators and democracy experts, it looked like the long-awaited confrontation between institutions trying to uphold the rule of law and a political force that had repeatedly tested how far it could push the system without facing consequences. The public reaction was immediate and intense, with supporters rallying behind Trump in anger and distrust, while critics expressed relief that accountability might finally be catching up to those who sought to undermine election results. And in the middle of this emotional storm stood a nation once again divided over truth, loyalty, and the meaning of democracy itself. This was not just another political scandal. It felt like the beginning of a reckoning, a moment when hidden strategies were being dragged into the light, and when the future of elections became the central question hanging over American politics. To fully grasp why the Georgia raid was seen by many as the starting point of Trump's broader effort to influence elections ahead of the midterms, one must rewind to the aftermath of the 2020 presidential race, when Trump's refusal to concede triggered an unprecedented wave of legal challenges, public rallies, and direct pressure on state officials, particularly in swing states where margins were razor thin and where changing a few thousand votes could alter history. In Georgia, that pressure reached extraordinary levels, with Trump personally calling top state officials and urging them to find enough votes to reverse his loss, language that sounded less like a request for investigation and more like a demand for a specific outcome, raising alarms among legal scholars who later argued that such actions blurred the line between political persuasion and attempted election interference. When courts rejected Trump's lawsuits and officials refused to overturn certified results, many assumed the battle was over. But behind the scenes, a quieter and more strategic phase appeared to begin as Trump-aligned lawyers and activists shifted their focus from courtroom challenges to the election systems themselves, questioning voting machines, pushing for forensic audits, and seeking access to sensitive election data under the claim of transparency. This shift was critical because instead of trying to reverse a single election, it aimed to cast doubt on the entire process, creating a narrative that elections were fundamentally flawed unless Trump or his allies won. A narrative that could justify future challenges, investigations, and even interference in upcoming races. Georgia once again became central to this strategy due to its importance as a swing state and its history of resisting Trump's pressure, making it both strategically valuable and symbolically significant. The raid was reportedly connected to efforts by Trump-aligned groups to access election technology in certain counties, potentially copying data and bypassing security protocols, actions that could compromise system integrity and violate multiple laws. Even without altering any votes, such access could later be used to fuel claims of tampering, creating chaos and distrust whenever election results were unfavorable, showing that the real weapon was not changing ballots but changing belief. As investigations widened, a complex network of individuals and organizations began to come into focus, including political consultants who coordinated messaging, lawyers who crafted controversial legal theories, activists who pushed local officials for access and audits, and media figures who amplified every claim of fraud regardless of evidence. This network operated with remarkable consistency across states, using similar language, strategies, and narratives, suggesting a coordinated effort rather than spontaneous concern about election integrity. One major tactic was overwhelming election offices with requests, lawsuits, and public pressure, creating confusion, delays, and vulnerability within systems already stretched thin by the pandemic and unprecedented voter turnout. In some rural Georgia counties, officials reportedly allowed unauthorized access to voting equipment, allegedly under pressure or persuasion from outside groups claiming to conduct investigations, a move that stunned security experts who warned that such breaches could permanently compromise election systems. The goal, critics argued, was not necessarily to change past results, but to gather information and build future narratives that could be weaponized during upcoming elections. By repeatedly suggesting machines were hacked or ballots manipulated, even without proof, the movement created an environment where millions of voters no longer trusted official results, a psychological shift that may have been the most damaging outcome of all. The Georgia raid thus symbolized the exposure of this slow, strategic erosion of trust, a process that threatened democracy not with sudden collapse, but with gradual decay. As the midterm elections drew closer, Trump's influence over the Republican Party grew stronger, with candidates seeking his endorsement by echoing his claims of election fraud and promising to overhaul voting systems once in office. Some went even further, openly suggesting they would refuse to certify election results they believed were suspicious, a radical break from democratic tradition that once guaranteed peaceful transitions of power. This transformation of election oversight into a partisan weapon alarmed democracy experts who warned that the very people responsible for ensuring fair elections were now campaigning on promises to challenge them. The Georgia raid became a central symbol in this battle, used by Trump to rally supporters and portray himself as a victim of a corrupt system, while also serving as proof to critics that serious legal boundaries may have been crossed. Every new detail that emerged fueled both sides, deepening division and reinforcing competing realities about what was happening. The political stakes were enormous because control of Congress could determine investigations, legislation, and even the direction of future elections themselves. What once seemed like a fight over one election had evolved into a struggle over the entire democratic system. In the end, the Georgia raid may be remembered as a turning point when hidden efforts to influence election systems were brought into public view, forcing Americans to confront how vulnerable their democracy had become to pressure, manipulation, and narrative warfare. It revealed a political environment where losing was no longer accepted and where power was pursued at almost any cost. Trump's actions, whether interpreted by supporters as a fight against corruption or by critics as a dangerous assault on democracy, exposed deep fractures within the nation's political culture. The raid was not a conclusion, but the beginning of accountability, a signal that institutions were finally responding to years of unprecedented pressure. Yet restoring trust would be far harder than enforcing laws because belief once shattered is difficult to rebuild. The midterms would test not just party strength, but the resilience of democratic norms themselves. And if there is one lasting lesson from Georgia, it is that democracy does not disappear overnight. It weakens slowly through doubt, pressure, and the willingness of powerful figures to challenge reality itself. The aftermath of the Georgia raid marked a silent shift in political strategy that many Americans did not immediately notice. Because while television screens were filled with shouting matches and social media battles over whether the investigation was justified or politically motivated, Trump and his closest allies were already thinking several steps ahead, recognizing that the traditional paths of overturning elections through courts had largely failed, and that the real power now lay in controlling the systems that ran elections themselves, a realization that would transform local races into the most important political battlegrounds in the country. Across multiple states, Trump began pouring attention and endorsements into obscure positions like county election officials, secretaries of state, and governors who held authority over certification and voting procedures, roles that had once been considered bureaucratic and nonpartisan, but were now becoming deeply politicized, with candidates openly promising loyalty to Trump's narrative of fraud and pledging to reshape election rules to prevent what they called stolen elections, even though courts had repeatedly rejected such claims. This shift represented a long-term strategy rather than a reaction to past loss, because by placing loyalists in charge of election oversight, Trump's movement could influence how ballots were counted, how disputes were resolved, and even whether results were certified, effectively giving political power direct influence over democratic processes that were once protected by neutrality and institutional norms. The Georgia raid, seen through this lens, felt like the first major attempt by authorities to interrupt this evolving strategy, to expose whether lines had already been crossed in pursuit of accessing election systems and gathering information that could be used in future contests. Legal scholars warned that even minor breaches of election infrastructure could create long-lasting vulnerabilities, not only in terms of security, but in public perception. Because once trust is damaged, every future election becomes easier to challenge and harder to defend. Behind the scenes, watchdog organizations worked urgently to reinforce protections, fearing that the system was being reshaped faster than safeguards could keep up. The battle had moved from ballots to control, from votes to the architecture of democracy itself. At the same time, the emotional and psychological impact of Trump's fraud narrative was spreading deeper into American society, creating a political culture where disbelief in election outcomes was no longer fringe, but mainstream among millions of voters, a transformation driven by constant repetition of claims, selective storytelling, and the powerful human tendency to believe information that aligns with identity and loyalty rather than evidence. Supporters gathered at rallies not just to cheer for policies, but to express shared outrage over what they believed was a stolen system, chanting slogans about taking back democracy and demanding drastic reforms, often without realizing that some of the proposed changes could actually weaken the very protections that ensure fair elections. A psychologist noted that when people feel their voice has been taken away, they become more willing to accept extreme solutions, including overriding institutions, justifying rule-breaking, and supporting leaders who promise strength over legality. Trump's messaging perfectly tapped into these emotions, portraying himself as a warrior fighting a corrupt system and painting investigations like the Georgia raid as proof that powerful forces were desperate to silence him. Every indictment, raid, or legal challenge was transformed into evidence of conspiracy rather than accountability, strengthening loyalty instead of weakening it. This feedback loop made democracy more vulnerable because enforcement no longer restored trust, but instead fueled further distrust. Within election offices across the country, the human cost of this political storm was becoming increasingly visible as officials responsible for running elections faced unprecedented levels of harassment, threats, and intimidation simply for doing their jobs according to law. Many received violent messages online. Some had protesters outside their homes, and others were forced to install security systems or move entirely, creating a climate of fear that drove experienced professionals out of public service. This loss of institutional knowledge created dangerous gaps, as seasoned administrators who understood complex election systems were replaced by newcomers, often under immense political pressure. The Georgia raid highlighted how this pressure environment could lead to risky decisions, such as allowing outside groups access to sensitive equipment under the claim of investigation. Security experts warned that once election systems are breached, even if no tampering occurs, their integrity is permanently compromised. The combination of fear, inexperience, and political influence created vulnerabilities that could be exploited in future elections. Democracy, they warned, depends not just on laws, but on people willing and able to uphold them under pressure. The situation in the United States began drawing increasing attention from the global community, with international observers noting unsettling parallels between America's political climate and patterns seen in countries experiencing democratic backsliding. Refusal to accept election outcomes, politicization of oversight bodies, and systematic erosion of trust were hallmarks of declining democracies around the world. Allied nations quietly expressed concern, while authoritarian regimes openly used America's turmoil as propaganda to argue that democracy was inherently unstable. The Georgia raid was reported internationally as a sign that the U.S. was grappling with internal threats to its democratic institutions. historians reminded the public that democracy rarely collapses suddenly, but weakens gradually through normalization of rule-breaking and erosion of norms. Trump's continued influence fit many of these historical patterns. The struggle over elections in America had become a global warning sign. Ultimately, the true meaning of the Georgia raid may only become clear years from now, not simply in court verdicts or political outcomes, but in whether it marked the moment when institutions began seriously confronting efforts to undermine election integrity at a systemic level. It forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about how fragile democratic systems can be when confronted by determined political power. The midterm elections became a test not just of party strength, but of democratic resilience itself. But Trump's movement continued to push narratives of fraud and corruption, showing no intention of retreating. Voters were left to navigate a political environment filled with doubt, anger, and competing realities. The future of elections depended on whether trust could be rebuilt and safeguards strengthened, and the Georgia raid would stand as a symbol of the moment America realized that democracy was no longer guaranteed. It had to be actively defended. It revealed a political environment where losing was no longer accepted and where power was pursued at almost any cost. Trump's actions, whether interpreted by supporters as a fight against corruption or by critics as a dangerous assault on democracy, exposed deep fractures within the nation's political culture. The raid was not a conclusion, but the beginning of accountability, a signal that institutions were finally responding to years of unprecedented pressure. Yet restoring trust would be far harder than enforcing laws because belief once shattered is difficult to rebuild. The midterms would test not just party strength, but the resilience of democratic norms themselves. And if there is one lasting lesson from Georgia, it is that democracy does not disappear overnight. It weakens slowly through doubt, pressure, and the willingness of powerful figures to challenge reality itself. As the political atmosphere grew heavier with every passing week, the ripple effects of the Georgia raid began quietly influencing conversations inside Washington itself, where lawmakers from both parties found themselves confronting a reality they had long avoided, that the struggle over elections was no longer an abstract debate about laws and procedures, but a direct conflict over power, loyalty, and the future of democratic norms. And behind closed doors, some admitted that the nation was entering uncharted territory where traditional safeguards were being tested in ways never seen before. Committees began discussing emergency reforms, cybersecurity protections, and stricter penalties for election interference, yet progress moved slowly, tangled in partisan battles where even the act of protecting elections had become politically charged, with some lawmakers fearing backlash from Trump's loyal base if they supported measures perceived as limiting his influence. Meanwhile, Trump continued holding rallies where he spoke not just as a former president, but as a leader of a movement convinced it had been robbed, repeating claims of fraud with theatrical certainty, igniting cheers from crowds who saw him as their champion against a corrupt system. And with every rally, the emotional divide between Americans grew wider. Analysts observed that Trump's power no longer came from office, but from narrative control. His ability to shape how millions perceived reality itself, turning investigations into attacks, losses into victories stolen, and accountability into oppression. The Georgia raid, rather than weakening his influence, often strengthened it among supporters, reinforcing their belief that he was fighting unseen enemies determined to stop him at all costs. This paradox made the situation more volatile, because traditional consequences that might deter wrongdoing instead became fuel for political mobilization. The nation seemed trapped in a cycle where truth and loyalty were in constant conflict, and loyalty was increasingly winning. Beyond the immediate political chaos, long-term consequences were beginning to take shape in ways that would influence American democracy for generations. As young voters grew up in a world where elections were constantly questioned, where no result felt final, and where trust in institutions was fragile at best, creating a generation that might view democratic processes not as stable foundations, but as tools of political struggle. Educators and civic leaders worried that this erosion of trust would permanently damage public participation, with some citizens disengaging entirely, while others became radicalized, believing only extreme action could protect their rights. The Georgia raid became a case study in this larger transformation, symbolizing both the effort to enforce accountability and the deep resistance to accepting democratic limits on power. Historians compared the moment to past periods of democratic crisis when societies stood at crossroads between reform and decline, emphasizing that the outcome depended not on a single event, but on collective choices made over time. Would institutions strengthen and adapt, or would political pressure continue to bend them toward partisanship and manipulation? Would voters demand truth and transparency, or retreat further into tribal loyalty and competing realities? The answers remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. The battle sparked by Georgia had grown far beyond one raid, becoming a defining struggle over the soul of American democracy itself. It revealed a political environment where losing was no longer accepted and where power was pursued at almost any cost. Trump's actions, whether interpreted by supporters as a fight against corruption or by critics as a dangerous assault on democracy, exposed deep fractures within the nation's political culture.